Welcome to the Cheating and Love Tales channel. I can't breathe. My lungs seize in the darkness of our bedroom. Outside the window, the world is asleep. But here, in this bed that once felt warm with promise, I'm gasping as though the air itself has been poisoned. A cold sweat pins me to the sheets. My heart pounds so loudly I'm certain it could wake the neighbors. I lurch upright, dragging in a ragged breath, and my hand, trembling, fumbles across the nightstand for my phone. Then I remember. I smashed it. Hours ago, I hurled it at the wall in a rage so fierce it left the screen shattered in 1,000 sharp pieces. No more calls, no more text messages, no more reading the digital footprints of her deception. I don't need those reminders anymore. Because I know. You see, I had been tracking her lies in a notebook. Every night, a new entry, columns labeled falseness, silence, smirk. It became my ritual, after brushing my teeth, to sit in the dim hallway light and scribble down that day's suspicious fragments. Maybe it was her voice pitch changing when she answered my questions about overtime work, or the faint odor of cologne on her blouse, one that certainly wasn't mine. I would note how she avoided eye contact, and how her hands twisted at the hem of her shirt whenever she told me that she was just tired and wanted to go to bed early. Eventually, all those little marks added up to something monstrous, a mountain of evidence overshadowing the life we once shared. I'm Michael Cooper, 45 years old, an investigative reporter by trade, a man who prides himself on exposing the truth. And yet the biggest lie of my life had settled right under my roof. My wife, Elizabeth, whom I believed to be the gentlest soul I'd ever met, was seeing another man, a man named Jack Reynolds. He was her boss for a while, though she always liked to call him her mentor, a smooth talker with a big office in downtown Chicago and an even bigger ego. She tried to downplay it for months, telling me Jack's just helping me with some freelance contracts, or he's got the connections I need. I had no reason to suspect anything at first, but the changes were there, if only I paid closer attention. I discovered it all in the worst possible way, through phone geolocation data. The dots on her timeline did not match her alibis. Instead of the coffee shop near her client's office, the map showed she'd spent 2 hours at some condo building on the other side of town, right during the time she claimed she was meeting Stacy for brunch. I confronted her about it one night, phone in hand, showing the glaring discrepancy. She laughed awkwardly, tried to brush it off as, the GPS must be glitching. But my gut roiled. Something was wrong, and no matter how many times she insisted otherwise, I could taste the bitter tang of betrayal on my tongue. A few nights later, I did something I'm not proud of. I followed her. I watched her drive from our quiet suburban home into Chicago's pulsing center, where neon lights glared off high-rise windows. She parked near a luxury apartment building, scurried inside without glancing back. My chest felt tight as I waited in the car, knuckles white on the steering wheel. An hour passed. 2 hours. By the time she emerged with a tall man at her side, I'd already realized the truth in my heart. She leaned in and gave him a kiss that was anything but friendly. My vision blurred. I wanted to open the car door, rush over, and cause a scene. But I couldn't move. I sat, paralyzed by shock and an unspeakable hurt that splintered my insides like broken glass. I confronted her the next morning after a night of no sleep. She looked so calm as she put on her makeup in the bathroom mirror. My voice was almost a whisper. "Where were you last night?" She turned, eyes widening for just a second before she feigned confusion. I snapped. I told her I'd seen her, that I'd watched her kiss him. She tried to deny it, but tears started pooling in her eyes. I saw the panic flicker across her face, a spark of fear. Then she said something about "it's not what you think," except I knew exactly what it was. That was the first time I felt the coldness settle in me. Some part of me died that morning. I remember standing in the bedroom doorway, watching her crumble, sobbing and reaching for me with trembling hands. I remember stepping back, away from her, as though she were contaminated. My phone was on the bed, where she'd placed it after checking the weather app for no apparent reason. In a fit of rage, I grabbed that phone and threw it at the wall. Glass shards exploded across the floor. That's when I decided. No more illusions. I told her to leave me alone, that I needed time to think. She begged me not to shut her out. Her tears came hot and fast, but I stared blankly, my chest hollow, my voice quiet. "I have to go to work," I said. That was my entire response. She stood there, arms limply at her sides, as I walked out without so much as a goodbye. At the office, I couldn't concentrate. My mind reeled with images of them together. Laughter shared, stolen touches. Every ring of the desk phone jarred me like a thunderclap. I typed words on my keyboard that made no sense. My editor asked if I was feeling all right. I lied and said I had a migraine. By lunchtime, I found myself rummaging through dusty boxes of files, as though some hidden scandal in the archives might distract me from my personal hell. But the numbness spread. I realized my investigative instincts had failed me at home, of all places. How many clues had I missed? Over the next days, Elizabeth tried to talk to me multiple times. She'd come into my home office, see me scribbling in that little black notebook, and freeze in the doorway. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to explain. But all I could hear was her half-hearted defense. "It's not what you think." No, it was worse. Because my imagination ran riot, conjuring them in bed. Her soft moans, his hands where mine used to roam. The betrayal cut so deep, I could hardly look at her without wanting to scream, or break something, or run away, and never come back. Then the DNA test arrived, confirming that Jack was no mere friend. That was a day that changed me forever. See, Elizabeth and I had never been able to have kids, a painful reality, but we'd come to accept it. Or so I believed. Yet she seemed oddly flustered the week before, fumbling with doctor's visits, intercepting mail as though worried I'd see it first. I got suspicious. I managed to get my hands on that test, and it revealed in cold, clinical text something unspeakable. She'd gotten pregnant, lost the baby early, and the potential father was Jack. For me, that was a final bullet to the heart. That night, I stopped sleeping. My pillow might as well have been stuffed with nails. Each hour, the clock's red digits burned into my mind. 2:00 a.m., 3:00 a.m., 4:00 a.m. The bitterness swelled until I could taste it on my tongue. And every so often, I'd climb out of bed, slip quietly to the hallway, and make another entry in the notebook. A single word. Betrayal, denial, guilt, or sometimes just a cold slash of ink to vent my rage. I was unraveling, yet from the outside, I stayed calm, almost eerily so. Elizabeth would try to meet my eyes in the morning, but I'd just nod, offer a grunt, and walk away. In the midst of this slow-motion collapse, a family dinner loomed. One of those forced gatherings we'd planned weeks ago. My parents, her parents, my sister. Part of me wanted to cancel, but a quieter, darker part insisted we keep it. I wanted them to see. I wanted them to know. I wondered if they already suspected something, if they glimpsed her phone lighting up late at night, or overheard suspicious remarks. And then, I wondered, did someone else already know about Jack? On the drive to the dinner, Elizabeth stared out the passenger window, hands folded in her lap. I could see her reflection in the glass, eyes rimmed red from crying. I said nothing. I pressed the gas pedal just a bit too hard, ignoring her startled glance. Silence strangled the car. I had no intention of comforting her. She had done this, or we had done this. My thoughts churned, but no, I refused to shoulder the blame. This was on her. We arrived half an hour late, breezing past my mother's worried greeting. I forced a curt nod, muttered a thanks for her invitation. The dining room was too bright, the overhead lights reflecting off polished cutlery. Everyone was already seated at the long table. My father coughed awkwardly as Elizabeth slid into her chair. I stood there for a moment, feeling my pulse thunder. Then I announced, "Sorry for the delay." My voice felt coarse, like it had been dragged over gravel. In the hush that followed, I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher in the adjacent kitchen. No one said a thing. I dropped my gaze on each relative in turn. I let them see the hollowness in my eyes. "You knew," I said, voice low. And I didn't. Now everyone knows. Glasses rattled as my sister flinched. My mother's eyes flickered to Elizabeth, then to me. Elizabeth went white as a sheet, visibly shrinking into her seat. Dad cleared his throat as if to say something, but then didn't dare. The tension was a physical thing, suffocating the room. I didn't care. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted them to squirm under the weight of this poison. Truth is, I suspected my sister might have noticed Elizabeth's suspicious behavior, or maybe she'd seen an odd message pop up on Elizabeth's phone. Or maybe her mother had dropped some hint of Jack's existence. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that I felt humiliated, betrayed not just by my wife, but by the circle of people who were supposed to protect me from harm. They had let me walk blindly into heartbreak. The metallic taste in my mouth grew stronger. No one said a word. It was as if my statement had frozen them in place. Elizabeth tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She managed only a whisper. "Michael, please." I cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't," I said. My hand trembled slightly. Inside, a storm raged. On the surface, I was a statue. Cold, unyielding. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, tears glistening on her lashes. I half expected someone to leap up in protest, to claim ignorance or defend her, but the silence pressed on. Slowly, I sank into my chair, fixing my gaze on the pristine white tablecloth. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, and I wished I could vanish. But I was locked in this moment, with nowhere to go. Food was served. Ridiculous, how we pretend normalcy. Platters of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The smell was nauseating. I picked up a fork, but didn't eat. Elizabeth likewise fiddled with her napkin, unable to lift her gaze. The rest tried to make stilted conversation, but every sentence died almost as soon as it began. My father tried. "We've been having a lot of rain lately," and trailed off into oblivion. My mother murmured about a nephew's graduation, then fell silent. The only conversation was the clink of utensils on plates. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I pushed my chair back with a screech that made everyone jump. "Thanks for dinner," I said, my voice calm but hollow. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. The front door closed behind me with a dull thud. Outside, the night air was cool on my face. My hands shook. I stuffed them in my pockets and paced along the driveway. Streetlights cast pools of yellowish light on the pavement. I was grateful for the darkness between them, the darkness that matched what I felt inside. In that gloom, images of Elizabeth and Jack flooded my mind. I saw their silhouette behind some closed door, heard her gasp of pleasure that once was mine. I remembered the times she used to laugh at my jokes, the way she'd curl up next to me on the couch, content just to be near me. It all felt like a cruel joke now, a beautiful painting defaced by some hideous scribble. I shut my eyes, inhaled the night air, and forced myself to stay silent. Because if I opened my mouth, I was afraid I'd start screaming and never stop. She came out after a while, her footsteps soft on the concrete. I felt her presence before I saw her. "Michael," she began, voice trembling. I didn't turn around. "Go back inside," I said in a low monotone. I heard her inhale sharply, as if she might protest, but she hesitated. She tried again. "Can we please talk about this at home?" "I know." I cut her off, turning abruptly. My face was still calm, but my eyes burned with quiet fury. I said, "Go back inside." She searched my face for any sign of mercy. Finding none, she swallowed and returned to the house. I was left with the night and my hatred, and a question I couldn't shake. Why didn't I see this coming? Time became a blur. The days that followed felt surreal. We barely spoke. She slept in the guest room, Her choice, or maybe mine. I can't remember. I'd sometimes hear her sobbing softly through the wall, but I'd lie there in bed, my fists clenched, listening. Then I'd get up, slip into the hallway, and add another line to the notebook. Desperation, regret, anger. I didn't know how else to deal with it. My heart felt like it was locked in a steel box. And then there were the flashbacks. They hit me at random moments, like a switch flipping in my brain. I'd be washing dishes, and suddenly I'd see Elizabeth's face the way it used to be when she was happy, her warm hazel eyes shining with delight, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. I'd remember our early years, how she'd surprise me by meeting me at the train station, a thermos of hot coffee in hand, or how she'd call me my brilliant journalist, even when I was stuck on some dead-end article. It felt like torture to relive those memories, knowing how far we'd fallen. One afternoon, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear to face the newsroom. Instead, I prowled around the house, rummaging through drawers, looking for anything that might give me a clearer picture. A part of me worried I was turning into a paranoid wreck, but I had to know every detail. I found an old photo album tucked in a closet. Pictures of Elizabeth and me at the Grand Canyon, all smiles and arms around each other. My throat tightened. I almost ripped the pages out in frustration. Instead, I threw the album into a cardboard box and shoved it to the back of the closet. That evening, Elizabeth was out. She'd said she had a meeting with a new design client, but I no longer believed anything she said. I sat alone in the living room, the TV muted, lights dim. I pictured her with him again. But this time, something shifted. My mind wandered to the final note I had yet to write in my notebook. For all the entries, for all the lines of heartbreak scrawled across the pages, I realized there was one last line missing. The final act, the moment I'd reclaim myself. I decided I needed to see him, Jack Reynolds. Confront him, man to man, not with fists, though the thought tempted me, but with the quiet steel of a man who has nothing left to lose. So I put on my coat, grabbed my car keys, and drove into the city. Traffic was murder, but it gave me time to rehearse what I might say. By the time I reached his high rise, it was nearly 9 at night. The doorman barred my entry. I insisted it was personal business, important, urgent. The doorman eyed me suspiciously. Maybe he saw the desperation carved into my face. But eventually, he let me up. When Jack opened the door, the faint smell of cologne and aftershave drifted out. He stood there, tall, salt and pepper hair slicked back, wearing an expensive tailored shirt. His expression flickered from surprise to something bordering on smugness. "Michael Cooper, right?" he said, as though greeting a casual acquaintance. "Elizabeth told me you might come by." Anger flared in my chest. I wanted to rip that smirk off his face, but I forced my voice to remain even. "I need to talk," I said. He stepped aside. The apartment was sleek, all glass and modern lines, a perfect reflection of the man himself. Inside, I found a living room overlooking the city's skyline. Lights twinkled below us. Jack offered me a drink. I declined. I was there for one reason. "You're sleeping with my wife," I said, my tone quiet, without a hint of question. Jack didn't deny it. Instead, he shrugged. "It's complicated. We never meant for things to go this far." I studied his face. A mix of guilt and defiance danced there. He set down his glass on a sleek coffee table. "Look, Michael, I'm not trying to rub salt in the wound. But Elizabeth, she and I, we..." His words drifted off. I stood motionless, fists tightening at my sides. "You have no idea what you've done," I said. "You've destroyed everything." He had the audacity to look almost sympathetic. "She said she felt lonely, that you were never around, that your work took priority." My jaw clenched. Something twisted in my gut. Maybe there was truth there, but it didn't justify what they'd done. My vision blurred with hot rage. "And you decided to fix that by screwing her behind my back," I hissed. He took a step back, raising his hands in a cautious gesture. I'm sorry, man. I really am. If I could go back, I cut him off with a single look. I didn't want to hear him rationalize. I just wanted him to see the hollow wreck I'd become. My voice broke for a moment. You took something from me. Something I can never get back. In that moment, a flicker of shame crossed his face, and I almost believed he felt remorse. But then he squared his shoulders and mustered up what I assumed was dignity. Do you want to hit me? He asked, as if offering me a twisted courtesy. If it'll make you feel better, do it. I shook my head. No, that's not how this ends. Then I turned and left. The hallway outside felt cold, endless. As the elevator descended, I felt my pulse slow, replaced by a terrible emptiness. Driving home, I realized I had no idea what to do next. My confrontation hadn't made anything better. If anything, it confirmed how little they both valued what we had. Yet a dark part of me felt satisfaction in seeing Jack's uneasy expression. He'd seen the shadow of vengeance in my eyes. I suspected he'd be looking over his shoulder from now on, wondering if I'd come back. That night, Elizabeth was on the couch when I entered. The TV flickered in the background, but she wasn't watching it. Her eyes snapped up at my arrival. She seemed to know exactly where I'd been. Michael, did you? I cut her off with a short nod. She swallowed. So now what? Her voice sounded small. I walked past her, numb, heading toward the bedroom without replying. Maybe I would have told her. I don't know, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't sleep that night either. My mind played out scenes, half imagined, half real. The two of them at some high-end bar, her laughing at his jokes, leaning close, her hand on his arm. Then they'd walk out together into the cold night, slip into a waiting cab, hands entwined, breath steaming in the darkness. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I needed an outlet, but all I had was my notebook. So I wrote, and wrote, page after page, fury spilling from my pen. The next morning, I woke up early, stumbled to the kitchen. Elizabeth was there, hair disheveled, eyes puffy. She tried to hand me a cup of coffee. I ignored it, pouring my own. For a moment, we stood in silence. Then she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Michael. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I don't know what else to say. I nodded slowly, took a sip. Don't say anything, I replied, turning away. In my head, I heard the screech of that phone smashing again, felt the shards cutting my fingertips. I realized I needed to do something decisive, something that would release me from this limbo. That same day, I scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer. Part of me wanted to see her reaction when I told her, but at the same time, I clung to some twisted hope that maybe she'd fight for us. Maybe we'd find a way to salvage what was left. But as the days dragged on, she seemed paralyzed by guilt, uncertain of how to reach me, or if it was even possible. My sister called me, hearing through the family grapevine that something terrible had gone down at that dinner. She tried to ask what happened, but I was curt. I hated that she might have known even a fraction of Elizabeth's infidelity. She insisted she had no idea, that I was jumping to conclusions. But I was past caring. Everyone felt like an accomplice, even if that was irrational. I started spacing out at work too. My editor tried to assign me a new story, something about political corruption in the city. Normally that would spark my interest, but I couldn't muster the drive. All the corruption I cared about was right here, in my own house. My performance slipped. Coworkers whispered that something was up. I let them whisper, let them assume. I just wanted the days to pass faster, as though speed might bring me closer to a resolution. One evening, Elizabeth cornered me in the living room. Michael, please, she said, voice shaking. Talk to me. I stared at her, noticing the weight she'd lost, the dark circles under her eyes. She reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. What do you want me to say? I asked, my tone deathly quiet. She started crying, tears rolling down her cheeks, but no sobs, just silent heartbreak. I'll do anything, she whispered. "I'll end it. I'll never see him again. I swear." For a fraction of a second, pity flickered through me. But then I remembered the geolocation data, the condo building, the DNA test. "You already burned it," I replied. "There's nothing left to save." Then I turned and walked out the door, leaving her there. It was a cruelty, but I no longer recognized myself. I went for a drive, aimless, passing through dimly lit streets. My mind wandered to revenge, some savage fantasy of humiliating Jack or making Elizabeth suffer the way I suffered. But a deeper voice inside me whispered that none of that would truly free me from the pain. I ended up parked outside a 24-hour diner, staring at the neon sign flickering open. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the streetlights lulling my exhausted mind. Eventually, I returned home. Elizabeth was in the bedroom, presumably asleep, though I knew she probably wasn't. I entered my office and found my notebook. I flipped through the pages, seeing my scribbled notes of heartbreak and anger, each one more desperate than the last. And then I turned to a fresh page. I wrote, "Revenge." Just that single word. Then I closed the book. Over the next week, I orchestrated my plan. It wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No violence, no dramatic confrontation in public. That was too easy, too fleeting. I wanted something that would cut as deeply as I had been cut. But I also wrestled with my conscience. Part of me wondered if it was worth it. Another part insisted I'd find no peace until I acted. So I chose a path somewhere in between. I spent hours digging into Jack's background. As a journalist, I knew how to uncover hidden details, loans, old lawsuits, career missteps. I found some interesting tidbits, a questionable deal from years ago that might warrant further scrutiny, hush money that changed hands. And then there was his ex-wife. A short phone call revealed she had no love lost for Jack Reynolds. She had her own grievances about how he treated her. I recorded that conversation, carefully noting each damning statement. Meanwhile, Elizabeth tried to appear normal, as though cooking a homemade meal and wearing a strained smile could patch this shattered mess. She clearly sensed my energy had shifted, less despairing, more intent. She'd ask, "Michael, what are you up to?" I'd offer a vague shrug. "Work," I'd say. She didn't dare push further. My coldness unnerved her. That was the effect I wanted. After collecting everything I needed, I invited Jack to meet me one last time. I told him we needed to settle things man to man. He hesitated but eventually agreed. We met at a quiet bar near the edge of town. Dim lighting, soft jazz in the background. He arrived in a crisp suit, though he looked uneasy, scanning the room for any sign of trouble. I sat at a small table in the corner, swirling a glass of whiskey I hadn't touched. He sat across from me, forced a thin smile. "Michael," he said, "good to see you." I didn't return the greeting. Instead, I slid an envelope across the table. Inside were the notes from my investigation, copies of questionable documents, references to hush payments. "You might want to read through these," I said evenly. He opened the envelope, eyes widening. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. I explained in a measured tone that I had enough to start a thorough inquiry through local media contacts. How a scandal involving potential fraud would look awful for him, especially given his executive position. "You get the picture," I finished, draining my whiskey. He stared at me, face pale, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You're blackmailing me?" he asked, voice low. I shrugged. "Call it leverage. I'm letting you know that if you ever come near my wife again, or if I so much as hear your name in connection with her, I will make all of this public. Every last detail. Your ex-wife is eager to talk. My editor is always looking for a story that sells. Don't test me." He exhaled sharply, hand clenching the envelope. For a moment, I saw fear in his eyes. Then he nodded, swallowing whatever pride he had left. "Fine," he said, voice trembling with suppressed anger. "You've made your point." I stood, tossing some bills on the table for the whiskey. Have a good night, I said. He glared at me, but I was already walking away. Outside, the air felt alive against my skin. Adrenaline surged through me. I climbed into my car, heart pounding. Part of me felt triumphant, another part hollow. I had taken a step toward revenge. But the real wound, the betrayal, still oozed inside me. This was only the beginning. When I got home, Elizabeth was awake, waiting in the living room, eyes huge with anxiety. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "Out," I said. She studied me for a moment, searching for a clue. I kept my face impassive. She hesitated, then took a shaky breath. "I told Jack we're done. I blocked his number, everything." I said nothing. She ventured, "I want us to try therapy. Maybe we can work through this." Her voice cracked with desperation. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch. Then I spoke with quiet finality. "I already settled things with Jack. You won't be seeing him again." Her eyes flickered with a mix of relief and dread. "And us," she whispered. I sighed, exhausted, as though I'd run a marathon. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know if I can forgive you, or if I want to." That night, she sobbed behind the locked door of the guest room. I pretended not to hear. I felt numb, floating in a sea of bitterness. Yet in the middle of the night, I dreamed of the early days of our marriage, of her laughter echoing in a sunlit kitchen. I woke up with tears on my cheeks, and no idea whether they were from sorrow or rage. Days turned into weeks. We coexisted under the same roof like ghosts, drifting around each other. She tried to show me kindness in small ways, cooking my favorite meals, tidying my office. But I couldn't bring myself to accept those gestures. The memory of her betrayal was too fresh, the images of her and Jack too vivid. My notebook entries became shorter, but heavier with meaning. Emptiness, ruin, fury. I began to see a therapist on my own. I didn't tell her. I needed a space where I could spill my torment. In session, I confessed to the therapist that I felt more dead than alive. That sometimes I spoke in a voice so flat it frightened me. He said it sounded like traumatic betrayal, that I needed to grieve properly. But how does one grieve a marriage that hasn't ended yet? The therapist offered empathy. I walked out each time, just as unsure as before, but a fraction less suffocated. Eventually, it became clear that something had to give. One late afternoon, Elizabeth approached me, eyes puffy, hair unkempt. She looked so different from the confident woman I married. "I can't keep living like this," she said. "If you want a divorce, please, let's just talk about it." She wiped tears from her cheeks, voice trembling. I studied her face. This woman I'd once loved so fiercely. I felt a pang of memories. Our road trip through the Southwest. The night we danced in the living room to an old jazz record. The day I proposed. Then reality clawed its way back in. "I've been to a lawyer," I said slowly. "I have the papers," she gasped, eyes wide, lips trembling. Silence swallowed us. Then she croaked, "Is that what you want?" My voice, steady and cold, answered, "What I want doesn't matter anymore. This is what we are." I reached for my briefcase, pulled out the file, and placed it on the table. She stared at it like it was a loaded gun. That night, the house was as still as a tomb. I drifted into the guest room while she slept, wanting one last look. She lay on her side, face streaked with dried tears. In the faint moonlight, she looked heartbreakingly fragile. My mind flickered with conflicting urges, to stroke her hair, to hold her until the nightmares went away, or to walk away forever and never see her again. I did neither. Instead, I turned and left, the taste of salt bitterness lingering on my lips. The next day was the day of a family meeting at my parents' place. They'd begged me to come, to talk things out. They wanted to help, but I was beyond help. I arrived alone. Elizabeth stayed behind, likely expecting a barrage of questions or accusations. My parents looked at me with worry etched into their faces. My father cleared his throat. "Son, we don't know all the details, but—" I cut him off gently. "It's done. We're filing." My mother's eyes widened. My sister, off to the side, just shook her head. I told them I didn't want their pity, that I just needed to handle this my way. They looked at me as though I were a wounded animal lashing out. Maybe I was. I didn't care. I left soon after, ignoring their calls for me to come back. The further I got from their concerned faces, the calmer I felt. My fury burned cold now, like dry ice scalding to the touch. That evening, I found Elizabeth in the living room again. She held the divorce papers in her hands, shaking. The sight of her watery eyes did nothing to soften me. I sat across from her, waiting, as if we were adversaries at a negotiation table. Finally, she said, "Can't we try counseling?" "I'll do anything, Michael. I know I betrayed you, but She faltered, swallowing hard. "I don't want to lose you." My heart twisted. A war raged inside. Part of me wanted to throw the papers into the fireplace and bury my face in her hair, to try to piece together the shards of our life. Another part, colder and older, insisted that trust, once broken, can never be restored. My voice emerged hollow. "I have no more words for you. Sign them, or don't. It's your choice." Then I stood and walked away, leaving her to stare at my retreating form. In the following weeks, she made attempts at couples therapy appointments. I refused to attend. She cried, insisted we could rebuild if I just give her a chance. But the image of her in another man's arms had burrowed too deeply into my psyche. Every time I tried to imagine moving forward, that memory cut me down again. I felt stuck in an endless loop of bitterness. My revenge had been served to Jack, but there was no real victory. The triumphant moment I'd envisioned was hollow. Yet ironically, the one place I found a semblance of control was my job. I threw myself into a big investigative piece, churning out interviews, uncovering leads, working late at the office. My editor was thrilled at the renewed fire in my belly. Only I knew it wasn't fire. It was a bleak desperation that demanded I lose myself in work. But at least it kept me from dwelling on Elizabeth's quiet sobbing, or the empty guest bed that used to be ours. During that time, she signed the divorce papers. She handed them to me one evening, her eyes rimmed red. "I won't fight you," she whispered, voice devoid of spirit. "If this is what you need, I'll do it." A strange ache pulsed in my chest. I took the papers, nodded curtly. "It is," I said. She bowed her head, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. Shortly afterward, we set the wheels in motion. I rented a small apartment near my office, a place without memories. She stayed behind in the house, at least until we could figure out what to do about selling it. One night, while packing up a few personal items, I found that little black notebook of mine, the one where I'd written daily columns about her lies. I flipped through page after page, each one a testament to my unraveling. In the last line, I read my scrawl from that night. Revenge. I realized, with a hollow jolt, that none of it had brought me peace. The next day, I returned to the house for a final pass through my old belongings. She was there, quietly sorting her design materials. We hardly spoke. Our interactions felt stiff and unfamiliar, as though we were strangers who'd once known each other intimately, but had no words left. I was rummaging through a drawer when I spotted an old Polaroid photo stuck in the back. Elizabeth and me at a carnival, laughing in front of a Ferris wheel. My hair was longer, her eyes bright with excitement. It felt like a memory from another lifetime. I stared at that photo for a long moment, then tucked it into my jacket pocket. She noticed me do it, but said nothing. Averted her gaze, as if the pain of that memory was too great to bear. I finished packing and walked to the front door. My heart pounded. This was the moment, the final closure of our life together under this roof. She followed, standing by the threshold, hands clasped in front of her. "I'm sorry," she whispered one last time, tears brimming. I met her eyes, and for a split second, I saw the woman I'd loved so fiercely, The woman who once was my whole world. My voice came out in a ragged breath. "Me too," I said. And then I left, the door clicking shut behind me, like the final punctuation mark on a story that had gone so wrong. The months that followed were a blur of paperwork, lonely meals in a cramped apartment, and half-hearted attempts by friends to cheer me up. My family tried to coax me into gatherings. I went once or twice, but I never stayed long. I was a ghost, drifting in the aftermath of betrayal. Jack kept his distance. I imagine he wasn't eager to provoke me after our last encounter. Word on the street was that he scaled back some of his less ethical ventures, probably worried I'd unleash that storm of scandal I had on file. I didn't care enough to follow through. My vengeance, such as it was, felt empty. Therapy continued, though I often left sessions feeling as if I'd only scratched the surface of my pain. Sometimes, the therapist would ask, "Have you really let yourself grieve?" And I'd respond with a stony silence. Because the truth is, I didn't know how. My heart was locked in an icy fortress. On the outside, I functioned. I wrote articles, paid bills, even managed polite small talk with coworkers. But on the inside, I was a wasteland. One rainy afternoon, as I was leaving work, I opened the trunk of my car to stash my briefcase. There it was, in an old cardboard box, my black notebook. I'd almost forgotten I'd thrown it in there during the move. On an impulse, I carried it back upstairs to my apartment. Sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages for the first time in weeks. Each scrawl of ink seemed to whisper to me. Falseness, silence, smirk, all the way to that final entry. Revenge. My hand trembled as I picked up a pen. I hovered over the blank page that remained. For a long time, I stared at it, uncertain what to write. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I penned 2 words. Let go. I closed the notebook for good, feeling a strange sense of release. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness. Maybe I'd never forgive what she did. But I realized I could no longer carry that hatred, not if I wanted to live. Even so, the final step loomed. The divorce hearing. We showed up at the courthouse on a gray Wednesday morning. Elizabeth stood beside her lawyer, eyes downcast. I waited with mine, the pit in my stomach twisting. When the judge declared our marriage dissolved, I felt a jolt. Elizabeth released a quiet sob, covering her mouth with her hand. I just stood there, stone-faced, my insides churning with relief and grief all at once. Afterward, in the hallway outside, I paused. She approached me, shoulders slumped. "Michael," she began, voice trembling. I wish." She trailed off, unable to form the rest of her sentence. I exhaled slowly, feeling as though a steel band was tightening around my ribs. "I know," I said simply. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with tears on her cheeks. A month later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Elizabeth had moved to a smaller place on the other side of the city. She quit her freelance gig for a while, took a break to sort out her life, or so the friend said. Jack Reynolds. As far as I knew, he'd kept to his penthouse and his corporate ladder. Maybe they still saw each other, maybe not. I didn't want to know. People often talk about closure, as if it's a neat bow you tie around your pain. But in my experience, it's not so tidy. It's more like a scar. It heals, but leaves a mark forever. I went through the motions of healing, taking on new projects, allowing myself small pleasures like a morning jog or a decent meal out. Gradually, life resumed a rhythm that no longer revolved around betrayal. But the memory remained. Sometimes on restless nights, I'd wake up and feel that suffocation again, that sense of choking in the darkness. My heart would pound, and I'd remember the day I smashed my phone, the day everything turned upside down. In those moments, I'd remind myself to breathe, to recall the words I wrote on that final page. Let go. Slowly, the panic would recede, leaving me hollow and calm. In the end, it all came down to a single truth. Some betrayals you can't fix, Some pains you can't erase, but you can survive them. You can learn to carry the scar and keep walking. I'm not the same man I was before Elizabeth's affair. There's a permanent chill in my soul, a cold caution that warns me not to trust too easily. Maybe that's my new reality, and maybe that's okay. Because in that cold lies a reminder that I'm still alive, that I can feel something, even if it's a distant ache. Sometimes I find myself in my apartment late at night, writing in a new notebook. Nothing about betrayal or revenge, just half-formed thoughts about the day, small notes of gratitude for sunlight or a good cup of coffee. It's not redemption, it's just life. A final memory stays with me, one I return to in my mind's eye. Elizabeth and I, newly married, dancing slowly in our living room. No music except the hum of the refrigerator. I had my arms around her, feeling her heartbeat against my chest. That was real, once. Even though so much went wrong later, I can't deny we had that moment. And maybe that's enough to remind me that love isn't always a lie. Sometimes it's just fragile, easily broken by human failing. Tonight, as I stand by the window of my apartment, the city lights spread out before me. I close my eyes. I feel the coldness within, but it doesn't scare me anymore. It's part of me now, like a shield. And maybe, in time, I'll find warmth again. If not, I'll at least find a way to keep breathing, keep living, keep moving forward. And that, in its own quiet way, is my final act of vengeance against the pain. Because I refuse to let it destroy what's left of me. So this is the end, or perhaps just another beginning. I no longer need the last note in that notebook. I've written my own ending, in calm defiance of the heartbreak that tried to bury me. Let those pages gather dust. I'm done with them. I'm done with Jack, done with Elizabeth, done with everything that dragged me into the suffocating dark. Tomorrow, I will wake up and remember to breathe. And that, I've learned, is a kind of victory all on its own.